I'm Dan Javorsek. I go by Animal, and I'm the president of EpiSci.
I'm Jason Brown. I go by Joe Boo. I'm the general manager for government at Applied Intuition. Thanks for joining us for this Nexus talk. So Animal, what excites you about the acquisition?
I think I'm probably the most excited about what Applied has done in the commercial sector. For so often, I would say the US government has been preaching this mantra that we need to leverage commercial in the things that we do. And fundamentally, commercial really hasn't penetrated. And I think that's because we failed to really understand and appreciate what that actually means.
Yeah.
You all have done a fantastic job of leveraging commercial, and I think blending the two companies together in such a way that we can benefit from the autonomy stack that you've created due to the virtues of a market economy where you had to survive first in that environment without just being fed this sort of contracts from the government is pretty important.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. So, I think in 2019, I started using the phrase software and data are the capabilities that matter most. And I would get these interesting looks from various different people in the military, Pentagon leadership and whatnot. I started really thinking about that when I saw our airmen use software and data to actually find things and actually enable people to make decisions that otherwise they couldn't if they didn't have leading software, world-class software at their fingertips. So as we kind of fast forward to today, you realize that this isn't just about the Department of Defense, it's competitive advantage. If you want competitive advantage, it's about software and data. And then being able to combine the capabilities of both of our companies, which are really all fundamentally about leveraging software and data to provide a competitive advantage for the Department of Defense, that for me is just incredibly exciting. I think we're going to do amazing things for warfighters, for our allies and partners. It's going to be a great future.
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous opportunity to think of data as a weapon, because right now, and I would say historically, we haven't, right? Since antiquity, in order to get some new capability, you had to build something new out of atoms, whether it was the English longbow and the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the invention of the airplane or the Gatling gun, all of these things were things built out of hardware. And we're living in this very interesting new era where software and this digital environment has revolutionized the world that we live in. I mean, our domestic lives are driven by these companies, Amazon, Google, X, Meta, and they are all data-driven organizations. They are data companies that just have an interface that does something useful for the user. And I think taking that to the Department of Defense is exactly what we mean when we say leveraging commercial.
For me personally, I spent 26 years in the United States Air Force. I spent a lot of that time just struggling with trying to accomplish the mission, watching my airmen struggle to accomplish the mission. I know what it's like to be in a situation where if you just had the information you were seeking right then, you could make the right decision that oftentimes were life and death. And that is a lot of weight on someone's shoulders, and people experience that every single day. We've been in nonstop combat operations fundamentally since 1991. There is someone struggling right now with a decision that could be augmented and supported by better capability that both of our companies coming together will provide. And so I know what that's like. I know the weight of those decisions. I know what it will mean when we are able to provide our combined capabilities to those warfighters in those situations.
Yeah, I think, I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s when going higher, faster, farther was really the benchmark of being a test pilot, which is what my profession was in the Air Force for 25 years. I had the opportunity to live a test pilot's dream. I got to fly lots of different airplanes, do things that I've never imagined would be possible. And yet, today, I am more excited about our future than I was doing that job. And the reason for that is that we are at a point in our nation's history to fully embrace the potential of the 21st century that I think Applied Intuition has done a fantastic job of seeing that implemented in the commercial sector with automotives, the automotive industry. And I think taking that and pointing it toward these defense problems where we do see people suffering, right? Think of how many times, I think for myself, much time I spent just trying to figure out how to push the right button at the right time in order to take advantage of the situation that I'm in, and allowing autonomy to offload that and allow my, future versions of myself, better looking and younger versions, that can return home safely to their families simply because they've had autonomy offloading all these mundane and routine tasks and allow them to do what's uniquely human, and that is focus on outthinking their adversary so that they can return home safely to their families. That is what animates me.
This is an old idea, which is really interesting because, the future of defense in 10 years is going to be much like what we've seen in many ways in the past, which is the many and the small, when effectively networked, will always beat the few and the large. We've seen that in different contexts and throughout history. Fundamentally, what's happening now is the technology that is enabling the many and the small are about them being effectively networked, about them operating autonomously. Whoever solves that problem, whoever figures out the many layers to that problem around navigation, around communication, around various different perception planning and control problems, whoever figures that out is going to have the competitive advantage in the 21st century. So the future of defense is really fundamentally solving that problem. And this is where we, both EpiSci and Applied Intuition coming together, are better postured to address that than anyone else.
That's right. I think if you look historically at the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, in that time since then, we've really gotten very slow. We've allowed these incumbent processes to build up, reduce the amount of competition that is fundamentally what I say galvanizes a market economy. And the virtues of that market are such that you have lots of competition for that. But that's not necessarily the way the last 30 or 40 years have gone, right? We've seen this distillation down to only a few prime contractors. And what I think Applied Intuition and EpiSci have the opportunity to do together is realize the democratization of software on a whole host of hardware platforms. Those hardware platforms were created by the large prime contractors in a way that is extremely valuable, but we can unlock the true unimagined potential in those systems. I care a lot more as a test pilot about what a system can do than what it was designed to do. And that's fundamentally what our teams together get to realize. Obviously, a lot of our conversation up to this point has focused on the air domain, and that kind of makes sense because we're both Air Force pilots. But if you really think about the graduate level application of these sorts of problem sets, this problem set that I would say I first really encountered in my driver's training class as a 15-year-old, this idea that I have to sense or perceive my environment, I have to make a decision in my mind, and then take action on that, and then resense the environment. That loop, no matter what you choose to call it, is applicable everywhere. And I would say when you look at the opportunities to distribute this across multiple domains, no one is better at this than the United States Navy because they fundamentally bridge multiple domains. When you see maritime operations, what you realize is a massive potential to help us deter, compel, and punish our adversaries in a way and in parts of the world that we know are going to be challenged in the next decade. The maritime environment fundamentally is a nice in-between, say, space between the two spots that our companies have really perfected. You all at Applied Intuition obviously have a lot of experience in the ground domain, but sometimes the ground domain is limited to roads and you have to maneuver in a tighter set of constraints. In air domain, you have multiple dimensions, 3 dimensions to operate in, and in maritime, you get a chance to play in 2 dimensions, but without quite the same level of confines that you would have in the ground one. So I think the maritime domain is a great opportunity for us to blend Applied Intuition and EpiSci's strengths.
Yeah, and most of the planet Earth is covered in water. And so you have to figure out how to leverage the maritime domain to your own competitive advantage. And even how do you combine your capabilities within multiple domains where you have various swarms that are operating collaboratively that enable each other to do things that they couldn't do on their own. And so this idea of collaborative autonomy between maritime and air, between certainly ground and air, this is really the future of the Department of Defense with regard to competitive advantage. Those who can figure out how all of these systems communicate, collaborate, and then work together, it's going to be critical. And anyone who figures that out is going to have the competitive advantage that leads them to success in the battlefield. I'll also say that this idea of collaborative autonomy is one of these areas where the Department of Defense is probably going to create technology that will actually feed back into the commercial sector. Right. So I think in maritime autonomy in particular, there's a lot of investment that the Department of Defense is making that you can easily see come back into the commercial sector. You could see that certainly in the air domain with aviation, and eventually with ground. And so we've already seen through our own company, Applied Intuition has been developing off-road autonomy that has fed back into our commercial business. So that same technology we developed specifically for the United States Army has come back into our agricultural, mining, and construction business. Mm-hmm. Autonomy is going to lead to a lot of different opportunities, not just for the Department of Defense, but for the commercial sector and fundamentally for the nation itself.
Yeah, when you look at integrated fire control for these cross-domain opportunities, you see that on the ground, we can carry a lot of really big, heavy, long-range stuff, but in the air, it costs us a lot to get those heavy long-range things up and airborne. Factoring in the surface and the maritime domains allows you to blend the best of both worlds. You get the long look angles and the value of the perspective from being at a higher altitude that comes with being in an airplane, and integrate that with a maritime domain that can carry a very large amount of high power weapons. If I were ever going to say there is an opportunity to leverage commercial, it is in the space domain, right? You have to live under a rock if you've not been paying attention to proliferated low Earth orbit. And what Elon Musk and Starlink is doing, I think, shows that there's a tremendous opportunity to orchestrate a very large number of assets that are commercially based, that have to survive in a commercial market, but could be leveraged for military applications. And what we develop, the software that we develop in EpiSci and in Applied Intuition, is able to, say, gain trust in its application in one domain and then maintain custody of that trust as you begin to scale it to the space environment. And in that place is where the graduate level work is really going to be done, because that is where the nation needs better orchestration, better command and control, and a better integration of those assets with the terrestrial ones.
Yeah, and certainly any of those hard problems I mentioned before around enabling the many and the small are going to somehow be either connected to assets in the space. They're going to be part of that same equation. They're going to be part of that fundamentally that collaborative swarm that is trying to accomplish a particular task or objective. And space is going to be maybe the critical part of this, especially when certain aspects of those capabilities in other domains either start to attrit, they start to maybe lose communication. What you're doing in space is going to matter more than ever.
Yeah, who would have ever thought that affordable mass would come to space, right?
Right.
And if we're learning anything from the Middle East and in Eastern Europe right now, we are seeing that quantity and affordable quantity has a value and a virtue all its own that is very different from the way that the US government has tended to procure new systems in the past.
If I had one message for the DoD, it would be, you've got to figure out how to procure software effectively. That's been a challenge, as we all know. There's been discussions on this ad nauseum about the challenges that exist. We've got to figure it out. So there's a lot of different, angles to that. There's the angle of, how do I ensure that the software is tied to, the vehicle that I'm procuring is effective, remains modular. And then what is the sustainment plan for that software? Software is never done. That's an old adage at this point. And the DoD has to figure out that there's going to be some aspect of leveraging what the commercial sector has done around software products. How do I ensure that I'm developing the right product, that that product is sustained, and that it fundamentally is serving the purpose it's meant to? How does software fundamentally be procured potentially in a very different way, maybe even separately from the hardware that you're buying? These are important questions that we've got to figure out. That is the biggest thing that the DoD has to figure out today. It's probably the biggest thing the DoD had to figure out 10 years ago. But we are at that moment where we, as a combined company, can support the DoD in fundamentally addressing that question.
Yeah, I think the number one message I would send to DoD is it's about time. It's about the tempo at which you make decisions. As long as you do that faster than your adversary, then you will be victorious, as we have been for thousands of years. But it is about time. It's also time for us to embrace this right now, because the 21st century has shown that autonomy and software are at this very critical point where they can revolutionize the way that we not just procure systems, but the way that we actually employ them and react and adapt to an adversary. Without a deep understanding of the temporal nature of what it takes to win, we as a Department of Defense and as a country will find ourselves on the wrong side of history.
It's fundamentally about figuring out how technology can fail and then how users might fail when applying that technology in certain situations. And so our job, in whether it's on our commercial business or whether it's in our defense business, is to understand where those failure modes might occur. We test for those failure modes, we monitor for those failure modes, and we continue to iterate on that technology. We're focused on making sure that failure modes are addressed before that technology is ever out in the field. And then when it is out in the field, we are constantly working with our customers to ensure that we understand whether that technology has the potential to fail or whether it's failing. And then we're working with them to ensure that we go back and address it. There's a lot of reasons to apply this technology safely and responsibly for competitive advantage, but we can easily see where the technology ceases to become a tool, it becomes a driver of behavior. We're also very, very concerned about how that happens. We talk a lot with various folks in the Department of Defense around responsible artificial intelligence and the practices and policies associated with it. We are not just complying with that, but we're actually engaged in ensuring that that concept and those various different techniques that are applied around responsible AI and using this technology in a safe way are actually implemented before they ever get out into the field.
Yeah, a lot of people, really their brains immediately go to what Hollywood kind of talks about and what Hollywood has played up for artificial intelligence, and almost all of them are dystopian.
Yeah.
Right. Whenever I talk about it from an EpiSci perspective, you'll notice that I use the word trust a massive amount of times. It may even seem like it's overly peppered throughout. And part of that is because it comes from, at least the approach I come from, is from test and evaluation, right? If I'm going to send something into an environment with very high consequences, these are not cat pictures on Facebook, right? These are the outcomes of the decisions that are made in these environments have very high consequences associated with them. And that's pretty typical of a lot of the military environments that we're seeing. That doesn't mean that we should shy away from using that, because I can guarantee you our adversaries will. But can we build the trust in that, do the testing, the evaluation, put the right boundaries and limits on the performance of this, and very critically, always retain humanity's involvement in this process. We talk about human on the loop in these sorts of environments, and that's very, very critical, because as a human, we have an ability to capture context, intent, and sentiment in an environment that is very critical for its responsible application in legal, moral, and ethical instances of the application of this. So, are we going to ignore it? The ubiquity, I think, of the technology is such that we can't. One of the things that we have committed ourselves on in Western society is that we will do this responsibly by keeping humans on the loop at all times, especially when there are legal, moral, and ethical implications to the outcome. Everything in technology is dual use. And so if you are going to go to a company, I think Applied Intuition and EpiSci, the fact that trusted is in kind of the core principle of the way that we are developing our software, the fact that it is in fact embraced by the user community, especially on the defense side, to maintain custody of that trust as we apply it to a whole host of other applications is a massive reason for why we need your talent and we need their talent to come and help us do that responsibly. Jobu, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss these important topics.
And Animal, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us for this Nexus Talk. We'll see you all very soon at the Air Force Association event in Colorado.